This passage begins for me probably the hardest section of Scripture upon which to dwell, the torturous destruction of Jesus Christ. And just to frame our discussion this morning a little better for you, this morning's message feels like a different sort of message for me. Because this passage has become deeply important to my faith in a way that it never was in the past. I mean, I grew up in the church. I grew up being taught this story, hearing this story. But as I've grown in my faith in Jesus Christ, the image, the vision, the picture that is recorded here in the 19th chapter of John affects me in a much more deep way than it ever has before. I actually tend to avoid vivid depictions of Christ's suffering. I may be one of the only Christians in all of America that's not yet watched The Passion of Christ. And I usually tell people that the reason I don't watch it is because I don't like watching movies where I know the ending. But it's usually just, I say that to kind of hide the truth. I don't think I could stand it. And there's a reason for that. Rooted deep into my heart and in my soul is the beauty and the purity of Jesus Christ. I carry with me a deep sense of His grace, His love, His wisdom, His perfection. And to contemplate the brutality of His suffering, frankly, disturbs me. The unfair, unjust nature of His death is almost too much for me to bear. There has never been a more innocent man who suffered a more brutal death. To witness His suffering is disturbing to me because my conviction that He is mercy embodied, He is love fulfilled, He is grace fully realized, and to see Him receive the punishment of a sinner is really difficult. And this conviction that I have of Christ's perfection, of Christ's beauty, I realize really flows from a multi-layered personal perspective. There is undoubtedly the nurturing of that perspective. Whenever I think about Jesus, my mind immediately goes to this picture of Christ that hung over my bed when I was about 9-10 years of age. When I was a kid, one of the things I asked for Christmas was this picture of Jesus that I had seen. And in it depicted the kind and gentle face of Jesus Christ as He knelt down to interact with children. And it was a picture that I would go to bed to every night. It was a picture whenever I would pray in my bed as a kid, I would look at and I would see when I would just sit there often just contemplating my life and who I was and what I was going to become. That was the face that I saw. And so whenever I think about Jesus, for me, in many ways, that's the Jesus that I see. And to envision that Jesus be beaten and tortured is really hard. I guess in many ways, it's easy for a skeptic to dismiss that as almost an indoctrination. Indoctrination into a belief about a religious figure that I've been told about or that I saw and that my parents would speak to me about in ways that were mythical. But honestly, that memory, as a contributor to my sense of Christ's gracious perfection, is only a small contribution to my understanding of who he is, in contrast to the impact that the confluence of my theology and my personal experience has been in shaping my profound view of the beauty and the holiness and the purity of Jesus Christ. This profound view of Christ that makes looking into the darkness that is the day of Christ's destruction most difficult. And what I mean by that is this. First of all, I know who I am. I know the darkness of my own heart, the pride that has at times defined my perception of myself and of others, the pride that fuels my selfishness, that can tempt me to use others, to dismiss the needs of others for my own comfort. I know the depths to which I can potentially sink as temptations of the flesh flash before me. I know who I am. For many of us, for I guess everyone in the world, we deceive ourselves into believing that we're good people. Not perfect, of course, but basically, generally, we deceive ourselves into believing that we are still good people. And when I read this story, what I realize is that self-deception is vividly on display in the death of Jesus Christ. There is a darkness, a cruelty expressed that is disturbing, but is much more closely to the hearts of each one of us than I think we like to admit. Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." We read that story, and although we can infer in its reading the cruelty that's taking place here, I think it's too easy for us to read it and not really realize the Jesus that stood before them in that moment. There's a simple line there. It says, "And they flogged Jesus." We read that, and in many ways, we can create a vision of that is more antiseptic than what took place. They took the cat o' nine tails, strips of leather that were embedded with metal and glass, and they stripped Jesus in front of everyone, and they tied him to a post, and they tore his flesh off his body. Those straps would wrap around his body and come all the way across to the front of his chest, and then when they would pull it out, that glass and that metal would tear away at his flesh. There are many men who suffered that, who died simply from that. And then they took long thorns and they shoved them into his brow, put a purple robe on him, and mocked him. And it was that Jesus, in that condition, that Pilate brought out again in front of the crowd. What he suffered wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to satisfy the darkness in the heart and the soul of that crowd. This is how deeply disturbing the sin of man is. That each one of those people in that crowd could not look at the goodness of this man and say, he has suffered enough. The fact that it could be even conceived, the treatment that he endured, is almost beyond thought. But they said it wasn't enough. What kind of cruelty did the Pharisees unleash? What kind of cruelty did the Romans inflict that they deemed was not enough? And in Pilate, we see man's capacity for justification and self-deception laid bare. He admits he sees no reason for doing this. And yet he accelerates and accelerates the punishment of Christ, justifying in his own heart each step of the way, until ultimately he washes his hands of the responsibility of the torturous murder of an innocent man. It was all about self-preservation on his part. He justified his actions because he was so afraid of what would happen to him if he didn't do this. The faux declaration of the Pharisees of "we have no king but Caesar," that cut so against their own convictions, their own very understanding of their lives, was literally a threat to Pilate. Pilate already was on thin ice with the Roman Empire. There have been multiple situations in which he had done actions that had caused him to be punished, for him to be disciplined. And so in an act of self-preservation, selfishness of unbelievable degrees, he justified the torture of this innocent man, the man he knew was innocent. I think one of the great uncomfortable benefits in studying this episode is in identifying the profound humanity that is represented in the Pharisees and Pilate. And I want you to hear again what I just said. In the accusers and the executioner, we see humanity fully on display. Do not isolate the depths of this. Do not set this aside as something that is unusual or strange, or really that distant from our own hearts. This is man's history, and this is man's destiny when given over to our darker impulses. Cruelty, selfishness, self-preservation at the expense of others. The justification of destruction displayed here represents not simply the heart of a man 2,000 years ago, but the nature of humanity displayed for all times. We lose some of the importance of this story when we distance ourselves from the sinful heart confronted with the perfection of Jesus Christ. We have in ourselves the innate capacity for justifying some of the worst behaviors imaginable. It is seemingly first nature for man to justify with, everyone makes mistakes, or no one's perfect, or they kind of brought it upon themselves, or I'm really not the one to blame for this. This capacity for justification, as with Pilate, fuels our way into the abyss of the destructive cycle of sin. Each step leading to the next as we become more comfortable with our sin, as we become less satisfied with its benefits. The law of diminishing returns conspiring with our carnal desires allows us to reject the nature of Christ in no less a cruel fashion than the Pharisees and the Romans. We are all sin addicts, And our capacity for sin seems almost boundless. And we can easily, when left to our own judgment, convince ourselves that we are not guilty of anything, really. This is my experience. This is my personal experience. The experience I have had in myself and the experience I've had with countless people in my life over the years. And it is the story of human history. And this is a place where my experience meets my theology. The Bible makes it clear. We are by our very nature given to sin. We are birthed as sinners, enslaved by our sinful nature. Psalms 51 reveals the foundational nature of our sinful state. The psalmist writes and says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." Jeremiah 17 explains it this way. It says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" Paul in Galatians 5 says, "For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you ought to do." And definitively, Romans chapter 7 says, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to even carry it out." The weight of my sin does not allow me to condemn Pilate or the Pharisees or even Peter as the denier. It forces me to identify with their sinful behavior in the face of Christ's beautiful grace. And that's why the second part of this story deepens the anguish of this sin for me. It is the full display of Christ's divine beauty in the face of this human cruelty. The fruit of sin displayed, the darkness of selfishness expressed, is heightened when it is met with the peace and the grace of Christ. From the beginning of the Passion story, we discover Christ's light shine in the midst of the darkness of the human heart. When they come to take him away in the garden, they come with swords and they come with soldiers and they come with malice. And Jesus Christ, in peace, gives himself in. He doesn't call to his followers to fight. He doesn't rise up. He doesn't yell. He doesn't scream. When Peter pulls out a sword and attempts to fight, Jesus heals the man who is about to take him to his death. He tells them, "I am he. Come and do that which you've come to do." His peace, his grace, even his mercy are on display. As he's brought before Pilate in the first conversation in the palace, he speaks calmly. He tells him it is not a kingdom that is of this place, and we're not fighting for anything, but it is something beyond this place. His response confounds Pilate as he tries to understand what Jesus is saying, what his motivation is, what his plan is, what he's trying to accomplish. But Jesus, in peace and in grace, speaks to Pilate. I hear his voice. I hear what he says. as Pilate is asking him this question in chapter 19. Understand again the scene. Jesus Christ has just been beaten nearly to death, bloodied. They've jammed the thorns into his brow, and he's brought before Pilate, and Pilate asks him a question. Can Jesus even stand at this moment? Can Jesus even breathe in this moment? And Pilate asks him a question, and Pilate says, "You're not going to answer me." But then Jesus, through his pain, through the blood, he says, "Listen, you have no authority over me." There is an unbelievable level of peace and faith spoken in the midst of that suffering. This is the beauty of Jesus. We see it as we peek ahead into the next chapter, right? As he's hanging on the cross. He who is innocent, he who is not worthy to suffer this at all, is hanging on a cross next to two thieves who have deserved it all. And when the one asks him to forgive him in his suffering, he says, "You will be with me today in paradise." When he looks down on those who beat him, the words out of his mouth are, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The beauty of Jesus Christ shines through the darkness of the sin of man in such a profound way in this story. This is Jesus showing us the divine light. The divine light of Christ stands in contrast to the darkness of humanity. He embodies every step of the way, the mercy, the grace, the peace, the beauty, the divinity that stands out in the darkness of our world. He embodies in the face of self-serving hatred of the Pharisees, the selfish cowardice of Pilate, and the indifferent cruelty of the soldiers, a peace and a grace like never before seen. Their sin, my sin, your sin, are met with a peace rooted in God's authority, rooted in God's mercy. Isaiah 53, generations before, showed us how the divine Son of God responds to the cruelest of acts. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. The divine Son of God willingly, in divine peace, received the full weight of man's sinful hate and extended divine grace. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, he opened not his mouth. And it is probably there that this story most undoes me. The story is hard for me because it reveals the depths of my sin, or the depths of sin itself. It illustrates violently the capacity of man's cruelty unleashed on the beauty of Christ. Our darkness contrasted in profound measures against his divine light. But the story ultimately crushes my pride, softens my heart, and drives me to my knees because he did it all for me. He became the Lamb of God to take away not only the sin of the world, but my sin. Isaiah 53 verse 7 does not use the image of the Lamb in a superficial way, but to reveal his sacrifice for our sinfulness. Because here is the context. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as from one who men hid their faces, he was despised, and they esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before the shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. I want you to understand a story of cruelty and anguish inflicted on the innocent is a story in any context that is difficult for me to hear. The times that I've spent in Rwanda interacting with those who had suffered during the genocide were difficult moments for me. On my first trip to Rwanda, visiting the Genocide Museum and walking through and seeing the faces and the pictures of the darkness of man's heart displayed on the bodies of children was hard. To go into the memorial, which was an old church where thousands of people were slaughtered. The blood-stained altar cloth showing the level of blood 3 feet off the ground. To go into the pit and see the skulls of all the children and all the people who were innocently killed there was really hard. I've only visited both of those places once because I felt I needed to. But I can't go back. It's just too hard. The innocent suffering at the hand of cruelty is difficult. But what causes this story to become one that transforms me is the realization he endured it all to free me from the weight of my sin. The real impact of this can't simply be, it seems cruel. The true impact that transforms us, that changes us, is when we realize he never had to endure it, but he did it for us. It was our sin on display. It was our sin that caused it. And he chose it so that we may be set free. And I'm going to tell you that until you understand your need for his sacrifice, this event recorded by John will never change you the way you need to be changed. I started this morning by telling you that this is a different message for me. And for me, it becomes incumbent upon me to try and express to you how personal this is for me. My entire life, for the most part, I've been a Christian. At age 7, I gave my heart to Jesus. By the time I was 15, I felt called into the ministry. And every step of the way, I felt really good about being a Christian. And I really felt like what I had learned, what I had understood, what I had been taught had transformed me and changed me in a way that made me a good person. I was somebody who didn't do the things that other people did. I was somebody who wasn't running around sleeping with my girlfriend. I was somebody who wasn't out drinking. I was somebody who always tried to figure out the pathway that Jesus Christ would have for me because I loved him in such a level that it changed my life. It changed my behavior. And as such, I always looked at it and I realized I have a really boring testimony because I'm actually a really good guy. You'd sit and you'd hear the stories of people whose deep sin had transformed their lives, had crushed their lives, and then Jesus came in and changed them. And you were like, yeah, man, you really needed that. And so I went off to Bible college, and I graduated, and I went into ministry, feeling pretty good about who I was and what I did for God. And there was a period in my life where I came back to Milwaukee and tried to figure out exactly where Jesus wanted me to go and what Jesus wanted me to do in ministry. And we'd figured the plan was we're going to come to Milwaukee and we're going to plant a church. And I'd done this in the past, and I had a timeline for that planting. And it'd be 6 months to a year. And every time we would try to start something, every time something would come up, we'd hit a brick wall, and we'd hit a brick wall, and we'd hit a brick wall. I'd taken a team of like a dozen people here, and they were all here for the purpose of planting a church. And 6 months passed, and a year passed, and 18 months passed, and 2 years passed, and we just couldn't get things going. And what I realized as I looked back, it took 2.5 years for Jesus to get through my thick skull that I wasn't good enough. That nothing I did in my abilities, nothing I did in my talent had any eternal impact. That I was as dark a sinner as any. It took me to get to that point to realize the depravity of my state. You see, in us, there is no good. We cannot create anything of any value because we are ourselves steeped in our sin. But Jesus Christ willingly took our sin upon him so that we might be washed and made clean. Come into a relationship with him. Build and create that which has divine purpose and divine meaning beyond this place. Find joy and peace and hope and life. Not in what we've done or how good we are, but in how that divine light of God stood against the darkness of sin. The sin of the Pharisees, the sin of Pilate, my own sin, to bring mercy and grace and hope. This is what undoes me every time. Nothing in me is of any value except that which has been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Each one of us needs to come to this story and come to that realization. No matter where you're at right now in your faith, no matter where you're at in your self-image, your self-view, the story has to always end the same. but for the grace of Jesus Christ and his willing sacrifice on the cross, I am a lost sinner. If you're here today and you continue in your sin and you continue in your life and you continue to tell yourself, no, I'm really a good person, I'm really a good person, I'm really a good person. I want you to know that the cross of Jesus Christ stands as testimony that you need him, that you're not good enough. If you're here this morning and you're a believer and you're a Christian, and you are too satisfied with where you're at, it's time for you to come to the point and realize how much you owe Jesus and how there is nothing that you can offer to him that ever measures up to what you need. Come to him on your knees every day and see the grace and the beauty and the mercy of Christ revealed on the cross. It is the regulating truth of every believer. It is the regulating reality that draws us away from sin because we are so touched and moved by him. It is the regulating truth that teaches us mercy and grace towards others. Because how can you stand at the foot of the cross, knowing you put him there and not have mercy and grace for others? Understand the depths of this story. It's not just something we reflect on once a year. It is a reality that we reflect on every single